the writer of Bronte Reimagined, or Anne Bronte. Adelle, if you would open up by telling us why you decided to write about Anne, please, and what your book's generally covering.
Okay, so hi Alex, hi Rowan. It's really nice to be invited to your book group, Alex.
No problem at all.
Yeah, I understand you normally talk about crime fiction. My book is as far away from, well, actually not too far away from crime, because I was doing a lot of investigating of my own to write the book. It's a biography of Anne Bronte, with kind of a twist. So it's not just a straight biography. I wanted to write about what makes the Brontes, and Anne in particular, relevant to modern readers, and what we can learn from her and her books if we put some of the context back in that's been lost, and also if we read her books from a modern perspective too. It's the third of a series about the Brontes, and I'd read the previous two by Claire O'Callaghan and Sophie Franklin, Emily Bronte Reappraised and Charlotte Bronte Revisited. And while I was reading those, I was just I had a narrative in my head going, oh my goodness, I really love what they're doing here. I really agree with a lot of the things that they're saying, and I was learning a lot about the historical context of the Brontes novels and things. And as I was reading those, I was thinking to myself, I feel like I have a lot to say about Anne in regards to, why she's still relevant today, and why her books were quite powerful at the time and very shocking, and caused a lot of fuss, I guess. So I've always been a fan of the Brontes, and unfortunately for me, I believed the lie that Anne was the boring Bronte for a very, very long time. So I had a lot of people saying things like, yeah, Jane Eyre's really good, Wuthering Heights is amazing, but don't bother with Anne's books because she's just not as talented. And that narrative is so prevalent and so kind of pervasive that it took until I was kind of in my early 20s to read Anne's books. And when I read them, I was just blown away. I thought, how can someone who's meant to be boring and very shy and retiring write books like this?
And we'll see in a minute why and what Rowan's done with Anne to bring it in line with the way you think about Anne. So Rowan, if you could tell us a bit about your new series, please, and the Brontes, and we're going to have your cover of your new one underneath in a second.
Yes. Oh, look at that. Yeah, I've got it. Hang on.
The Diabolical Bone number 2.
Oh, so my series it's called Bronte Mysteries, and it imagines that before they were renowned authors, the Bronte sisters were amateur sleuths. It's very kind of leans very much into their fiction. It's gothic, kind of gothic, quite dark, but also quite light. Very inspired by the history, the context of their lives, their biographies, and who I think they were as people, based on a lot of reading about their lives, reading their letters, the things that they owned, the things they were interested in, the books on their shelves. All of these things contributed to this idea, and I basically just have an absolute blast writing it. I love it. It's just the most joyous experience of my life. So it's basically a Victorian murder mystery, and much like sort of Sherlock Holmes in bonnets, or Buffy and Crinoline, and and they just go around. They so, for example, in the first book, they hear of a missing woman who's vanished from her home, Chester Grange, There's no sign of her. All that's left behind is a room covered in blood, and it doesn't seem to them that anybody's doing very much to find out what's happened to her, because policing is in its infancy. There's only one constable for the county, and he's paid by the man whose wife's gone missing. And they just decide, they're very curious, intelligent, bright women, and they just decide to go and have a look and see what they can see. And they embark on a journey that turns them into detectives, the same as the new detectives that have just started to turn up in London. And they have a very fun adventure, much peril, some certain death, and then Diabolic Bones. We're back again to solve the mystery of a child's skeleton that's been found bricked up in a chimney.
Very, very different to plot. Adelle, as you've been doing Brontes for your PhD, and you've been reading the two books for this interview, what would you say that Rowan has done with the sisters that you would think is accurate to the three of them?
I really enjoyed the characters of all three of them, and it's very clear that Rowan, you absolutely love them. It's written with a lot of affection, I think, for the kind of people that they were, and I think a lot of the time we like to think we know more about them than we actually do. There's very little of them that's been left behind to us, so not very. I mean, we have quite a few of Charlotte's letters and Charlotte's the writing that she did when she was a child and a teenager. But when it comes to Anne and Emily, we have very, very little. So we've got some diary papers that they wrote together, and I think there are 5 letters of Anne's. And I feel like the way that Rowan's written about them in the novels, there is kind of, you can see that voice, I think, from the letters, the Brontes letters kind of coming through. But just from the kind of books that the Brontes themselves wrote and the things that we know they were passionate about, like Anne was very much, she was very interested in making sure, well, she was very passionate about making sure that she made other people's lives better, or she worked to the best of her abilities to make life easier for others and do everything that she could to be a good person, and not just for the sake of being a good person either. She had a lot of empathy, and I feel like that comes across in the way that you've written Anne in both of these novels. She's very curious, and she's very astute, and she's a very good judge of character, which are all very good qualities for an amateur detective to have. And I really like the sibling relationship as well, and they work just as they worked very well together as kind of critics of each other's writing and helping each other to edit and things like that. The characters in the books, they're very good at critiquing each other's ideas without getting too personal, I guess. You know, there's very believable sibling relationships going on in the books, which I really enjoyed.
Sometimes they get a bit personal. Thank you, Adelle. It's so nice for you to say that. It means a lot having read your book. But I really wanted to write something, because you're absolutely right that I think we know about 5% of the whole of their lives. We've got some material, there's a massive amount of their lives that we don't know, which to me as a novelist just gives me massive scope for stories. And I really wanted to write something that was fun and adventurous and exciting, and a bit scary and a bit kind of sweeping in the vein of many of their novels, because I think a lot of prior to, you know, a lot of the things written about the Brontes is terribly sad and tragic, and focuses on so much on their short life and all the tragedy in their lives. But actually, they achieved amazing things in the years that they were alive. I mean, they absolutely changed the world of literature, and it's taken a while for Anne in particular to get the kind of standing that she deserves in literary history. But she was 150 years ago writing with such clarity and direction and passion in her novels that, you know, I wanted to just bring some of that to the page in a sort of an adventurous way, and as a pure kind of geek fangirl nutter about these women. I just wanted the opportunity to give them a little bit more life, even if it's a fictional fantasy imaginary life, and I kind of feel like they would have approved of that. So maybe, hopefully, I'm just looking at my bust of Charlotte to see if she's scowling at me. But Adelle, what do you think you discovered about Anne when you were going through this book? What was the main revelation to you?
I think the main thing was just how this idea of Anne as the boring Bronte has persisted for so long, and where it came from, and that is kind of, that's fed into the research that I'm doing now. So I have a whole chapter in Anne Bronte Reimagined about how Anne's books were edited, especially after her death. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Charlotte asked the publisher to never publish it again because she said that the book was an entire mistake. And I think she wrote that in multiple letters and wrote it in a biographical notice to Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights. And yeah, that was the biggest thing I took away, I think, because by the point that I was researching and writing the book, I already had a very defined sense of the kind of person that I thought Anne possibly was. But yeah, the biggest thing that I discovered was just how deep-rooted all of these opinions about Anne were, and how they have been repeated as well, almost as if nobody feels like it's necessary to reread her books or do their own research. They can just say, oh yeah, she wasn't as good. She was too religious. She was too preachy. But yeah, seeing the evolution of people's opinions towards Anne and her reputation over the years was, I think, the biggest thing that I took away from that.
For me, it was the sibling relationships between the three sisters and the brother Branwell. Branwell I find quite hilarious in Rowan's depiction. What was the fun bit about writing Branwell, and how did you find doing that, please, Rowan?
I don't know, I was initially quite resistant to Branwell. He gets why does he get all this attention? He didn't write any brilliant novels. But then as I was kind of reading more about him and thinking more about everything that he went through, and he had he tragically, foolishly engaged in a affair with his married boss's wife, and it basically sent him on a spiral of self-destructive behavior that ultimately ended in his death. And there's a lot that we can say about that. Mrs. Gaskell kind of blamed poor Mrs. Robinson on the death of all of the Brontes, I think when I thought about Branwell a bit more, I realised that he had an incredible weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He was the only son, and a lot of investment had been put into him in terms of his education, and sort of trying to prepare him in that he would have enough of a living in order to support his whole family, because nobody expected Charlotte or Anne to particularly get married. and he just never quite managed to live up to that expectation. He made quite a lot of ill judgments, and when he was in love, when he was heartbroken, he just couldn't contain it at all. So I think about him, and he loved a married woman who he couldn't be with, and I think about Charlotte, who definitely had a form of love for a married man who she couldn't be with. I feel like it's a romantic love, but there's no evidence or nothing to say that there was any kind of wrongdoing between them, especially not on the part of the man that she was in love with, Constantine Heger. He seems to have been exemplary, well behaved, but she really loved him. She wrote him a couple of incredibly passionate love letters full of unrequited love. The difference between Charlotte and Branwell is that Branwell, as a man, was able to express his misery in a whole different way, and he was able to drink and write poems, anonymous poems to Mrs. Robinson, and publish them in the local paper, and basically trail his misery up and down the streets of Haworth, telling everybody who would, listen to him. Whereas Charlotte absolutely did not have that. She could not talk about the way that she felt. She could not express it outwardly at all. She had to repress it and push it in, and just basically get on with her life, which was, I think, really hard for her because she had quite a few romantic setbacks, bless her. So in the end, this is a very long way of saying, in the end, I kind of came around to thinking of Branwell as the sort of fourth sibling who never quite lived up to the brilliance of his sisters.
Yeah.
And he kind of knew that, and he knew, I think, for me, my Branwell, he knows that he's throwing his life away, and he sees opportunities to change and to put the brakes on and to change direction of his life, to slip by further and further and further as his sisters go from strength to strength. And for him, is really his conflict. Is as much as he loves them and as much as he wants to do as well as them, he can't find that inner strength because he's so broken.
Adelle, as someone that's read the Brontes from cover to cover, what would you say is the book which has got the most mystery in it?
Off the top of my head, I think I'd have to go with Wuthering Heights. I mean, Heathcliff disappears for years and comes back a gentleman, and he has money from somewhere, and it's never really explained how that transformation happened. And that whole book, I think, if you're looking at it from a crime perspective, it's almost like you're watching it, you're on the other side of the mirror, I guess, in that case, because you're watching Heathcliff completely destroy two families, and you're getting to see his mastermind kind of plan as it's unfolding as the reader. And I feel like if that had been written as a crime novel from the other perspective, a few years later, trying to find out who has done this and who the houses actually belong to, and how the family trees connect and all this kind of thing. There's a lot going on in that novel that, I've never thought about them like that before, in terms of which one has the most mystery and suspense and things. But I think Wuthering Heights definitely has a lot of that going on. And then the more I think about it, actually, the more all of them have a sense of that happening. So you've got Jane Eyre, and you've got the wife who's being kept in the attic, and this mysterious caretaker, Grace Poole, who sits in a rocking chair and drinks gin all day, and Jane can't figure out why she's there, why she's necessary. And
and makes me laugh that bit. That was just so Adelle, because you're joining us tomorrow. Hooray! I haven't told you which bit you're going to read yet. I do a daily read along of Jane Eyre on my Instagram page, and we've been doing it since November, and it's just a really lovely slow think about Jane Eyre. I was just saying today in today's read along that if you picked up that book, if it had been published yesterday and you knew nothing about it, you didn't know about any of the adaptations or anything you've heard or anything, you know, at all about it, the way that the big twist and the reveal is delivered is absolutely brilliant, and it's an absolute brilliant payoff of a building mystery. So I do definitely think there are a lot of mystery elements in all of their novels.
I was watching Jane Eyre yesterday, in actual fact, and I just realised how much mystery was involved, because you didn't know about the wife in the attic until until later and later in the book, and because it was a TV adaptation, it was even later. So
I can still remember the first time that I read it without knowing anything about that book, and the surprise and the shock. I still remember it to this day, because I was completely unprepared for that, let me tell you.
Definitely, yeah, absolutely, because it was a real surprise for me, because primarily it's definitely about the relationship between Jane Eyre and Rochester. So to have that mystery underpinning the whole thing is complicated. How would you say you managed to take the Brontes as a style and underpin that in your work, Rowan, in the two that you've written so far?
I mean, I don't try particularly to mimic their styles, because I don't really think that I could do that. I think that there's for a couple of reasons. I mean, Emily's style of in Wuthering Heights is just so unique and musical and loud and clashing and combative. It's kind of combative, I think, style that just wouldn't come naturally to me, and I don't think that I would do it justice. And Charlotte's writing in Jane Eyre is absolutely brilliant precision, but also a lot of observation, which we're not really allowed to do anymore in 20th century novels. There's a half a chapter of Charlotte having a look at people and describing them and telling us what she thinks of them, which wouldn't be allowed now, even though it's really interesting and I really enjoy it. So I think actually I just kind of brought my own style to that era, but I think if it was any of the sisters, it'd be more like Anne's than anyone's, I think, because she just has a very direct style. She's not particularly interested in beautiful imagery or dwelling on any particular emotion or philosophy in any way that isn't almost instantly deliverable. And so I think possibly that would be the most closest comparison, but I think to mimic them would be it would be a fool's errand. So really it's just my own voice in my own Victorian voice. Because I do like to pretend that I'm Victorian, Alex. Have I mentioned that? I don't know.
Yeah. The science elements of the two books you've written are very, very intriguing, and the way you've incorporated the modern with the period is really, really good. How did you manage to do that?
I just really enjoyed that, actually. I like the challenge of wondering if you can get that sort of forensic analysis in before there was forensic analysis in any way. And it's just a lot of reading, and I was looking for the first cases where teeth were used as an to identify somebody, and it's all really much later. It's not until sort of towards the end of the 19th century. So then I was thinking, well, who would know if all you had to go on was a single tooth? Who would you take that to? A tooth and a rib bone in the Vanished Bride are the only remains that they find, and so they end up taking it to a doctor in Bradford to have a look at, but he's not there. His wife, who went to university but isn't allowed to be a doctor, is there, and she is able to give them quite a lot of information. And then in the diabolical bones, we have a set of bones, children's bones found, and there's not a lot you can tell about a skeleton prior to a certain age. You can't tell if it's male, you can't tell if it's female, but you can tell what kind of life it's lived. If there's evidence of malnutrition or poverty, there'd be a sort of porousness in the bones, or sort of weaving together of the ribs, I think, from memory. It's been a while. And really interesting things that you can see in a skeleton that shows sort of traumas that person may have lived through in their short time, and also that it might have been unusually small if they were undernourished or malnourished or whatever. So that was all very interesting as well. And I do love the sort of dark and the gothic elements of mystery novels. So doing that kind of research really is just a super fun day at the office for me.
When going into the research, Howarth is really a key part of both your research. And when I was talking to Adelle the other day, apparently you did a lot of visits to Howarth, and how has that been an influence on your life, would you say, Adelle?
It's been quite a big influence. So I read at the beginning of The Vanished Bride, Rowan, you have a kind of foreword where you say you went to the parsonage for the first time when you were 10, I think. I had a very similar experience. So two of my mum's friends took us to Haworth one day, and we went to the Parsonage Museum, and I'd never really heard or thought about the Brontes very much prior to this. And just the parsonage is such a wonderful museum. It makes them feel very, very immediate in a way that reading a biography can't really do. But yeah, I remember walking through this museum that is it's made to look exactly how it would have done while they were living there, or as close as they can possibly get it. And yeah, I remember being 11 years old. I was quite a strange child anyway, and did a lot of kind of making up my own stories and drawing maps and things anyway. And so when I saw all these miniature books and maps that they'd drawn and worlds that they'd made up as children, I remember thinking, gosh, there are writers who were kind of like me. This is really cool. And they're not like all of the other authors I've heard about. They're not rich people from London, which, for Victorians, I guess that was, if you wanted to write, you had to have the means to do so. Whereas these were 3 women living not very far away from where I lived growing up, doing very similar things to me. And even though they were alive maybe close to 200 years ago, they felt very, very relatable, which is one of the things that I really love about their books, especially Anne. They have very kind of modern voices. But yeah, so after that first visit to the parsonage, we actually decided to walk to Top Withens on the same day, which was probably a mistake. And I have a very vivid memory of being chased by a ram, which which is hilarious looking back on it, but as an 11-year-old, it was quite traumatic. But yeah, after we'd kind of discovered Haworth and realised how close by it was, we would go back up maybe twice a year, just because the village itself is so lovely. And I've spent quite a few birthdays in the parsonage, just because I think once you connect with the Brontes in some way, they kind of really, you either get obsessed or you're not that interested, I guess. Once you've been to the parsonage once, it's very hard not to want to learn everything that you can about them.
So the way that you describe that is it almost exactly the same as my first experience of going there. I think they appeal to those kind of odd, creative little girls probably who make their own tiny little books at home. And yeah, that was really exactly my experience of my first trip there. And I love how if I go there, I mean, not recently, but I try very hard to go there as much as I possibly can. I'm trying quite hard to live there. So
yeah, I think we'd all like to live in the was we writing, but with Howard being so well kept in that museum, how important was the visits when you were doing the research for you, Rowan? Yeah.
Oh God, I mean, it's priceless. To be able to have that house and to have the artifacts, to walk around it, to be able to visit the research library and talk to the amazing experts that work there, it's incredible. And I just think actually, to say that it's to have something like that, to have that house and everything in it as part of our national literary heritage is so precious. And it is under incredible pressure and danger at the moment of collapsing because of the pandemic. So if you care about books and you care about your literary heritage, please go and visit the Bronte Parsonage Museum website, and if you can, bung them a couple of quid or buy something lovely from their gift shop for your next birthday present or Valentine's present, because they really, really need our help and our support at the moment. It would be an absolute tragedy if we lost our access to these incredible resources that we have, like the Bronte Parsonage or Jane Austen House, or some of the smaller museums that we have in London that are also under threat at the moment. We really need to protect them, I think, because that's part of us. We're all part of the same genealogy. There wouldn't be me in my books if there hadn't have been Charlotte, Anne and Emily in their books. If I hadn't had that daughter walk through when I was 10 years old, there's a good chance I may never have decided to try and be a writer. So it's very important to keep that going, I think.
Yeah, and I think if anybody has ever considered becoming a member of the Bronte Society, I think the pandemic is the perfect time, because you'd get access to Bronte Studies, which is an incredible archive of all of these journals and articles and things written about the Brontes and their works. It's an amazing resource.
Yeah, it is.
When you were first thinking about writing, Rowan, you didn't always start with crime. The first one I read of yours was the memory game, and that had mystery in there too. So what would you say was your style change, or would you say it's not really changed that much?
I think my style changes depending on the sort of book I'm writing. So I've always liked to write under multi genres. I've never sort of particularly been wedded to one genre, which has its benefits, but also its drawbacks, I suppose, because people don't always know what they're going to get from me. But the memory book did have a sort of central mystery based around a love story, and that book taught me a lot about plotting and revealing and pacing. But I think for me, genuinely, ever since I've started writing, I'm always trying to write Jane Eyre or similar, because to me, it's that book that just does everything. It has incredible atmosphere. It has an enormous amount to say to any individual who's trying to find their feet in the world. It has absolutely breathtaking romantic storyline, which is slightly problematic, and it has the 100% best twist in classic literature, I think, that there is. So in my opinion, and I remember just from the first time I've read it to the latest time reading it, just feeling absolutely swept along by it and transported and in another world, standing right next to Jane in the very same room as her most of the time. And that is just what I want to do. That's what I aspire to create, and that's what I try to do with my writing whenever I can.
Well, I definitely think you've been successful at it. Yeah.
Oh, shucks. Thanks.
When I first met Adelle, we were in a writing group, writing short stories in competitions, and I was just curious as to how you first started, Rowan.
How I first started writing?
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to write, but I am dyslexic, so I just thought it was probably too hard to try, because I did try. Really, I spent most of my education being told I was lazy and sloppy and didn't try hard enough. And the truth was, I was trying really hard all of the time. So being told that constantly when I was trying my best was kind of disillusioning. But I did somehow manage to, with the help of a couple of very good teachers, get through to university. When I was at university, was diagnosed as dyslexic, which really did help me come to terms with the fact that it wasn't me being lazy and rubbish. It's just this and this. And so I had a lovely time at university, went to work in bookselling after that, because I still didn't think I could write a book. It was just, and the more I worked around books, the harder it seemed to me, and the more likely I was to fail. And so actually what happened is that I was working quite deeply as an editorial manager for a non-fiction publishers in right at the end of the 90s, when I saw a short story competition, Young Writer of the Year short story competition in Company magazine, and the cutoff point for being a young writer was 30, and I was 29 and a half. So I had a massive existential crisis. Thought, oh my God, I'm going to be so old. Now, 20 years later, I'm like, I wish. But anyway, I wrote a short story, posted it because it was the olden days, and it was definitely full of loads of mistakes and typos and all sorts of stuff. But 6 weeks later, found out that I'd won the competition, and that really set me on a road to believing that a story is more than about punctuation and spelling, and that if you have the idea and you have the creativity, you can get that story out there if it captures the imagination of the people that are reading it. So I suppose I started really taking it seriously then, and started work on my first novel right after winning that competition.
First novels and writing is always a challenge.
Yes, well, sometimes it's a challenge, but also because you've had it in your head. I mean, I had the story in my head for about 5 years. It was just the writing it down bit that I'd avoided. So I think the first novels are nice because you've got a lot of idea. You've got the ideas fully formed in your head. Second novel's a bit of a shock because you have to think of a new one.
Yeah. When you were writing the book, Adelle, what was it like? Because you were bookbinding at the time, I think, is it?
Yeah. Sorry, Alex, before I answer your question, Rowan, it's really funny that you say that, you had the stories there and your difficulty was with writing them down, and you learned that writing a good story is more than just about punctuation and things, because you look at some of the Brontes' handwriting and some of their, especially Emily's diary papers, and the spelling and punctuation and the handwriting is absolutely atrocious. It's really, really bad. And, you know, the things that they were writing as teenagers as well. Whenever you read a transcription of them, there'll be massive editor's notes about how they've kept some of the original spelling, but they've corrected some of it to make it a bit clearer. You know, it was all over the place. And I think it's really easy to forget that the things that they wrote didn't just appear perfectly formed. It's easy to forget that when you read anything, really, I guess. Yeah. Like there's a lot of hard work that goes into writing any novel. It doesn't just, you know, they're not, we're told that they were geniuses, and they are, but that doesn't mean that it just kind of fell out onto the page perfectly formed.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And I do get so much joy from those diary papers as well. So just looking at them going, these are just a couple of, you know, young women messing around.
Yeah. Sorry, Alex.
Yeah, I was asking about how you started, because you were bookbinding at the time, I believe.
Yeah, so I was in a very, very different career to begin with. I was a physicist for a long time, but it was, you know, I'd always wanted to write, but in the back of my head, I had this idea that I had to have a backup plan, and I had to be good at something that would make me successful and earn me lots of money, so that I could always have writing as a hobby. And it didn't work out like that. I felt a bit stuck in a career that didn't really suit me, and I wasn't enjoying it anymore. And so I switched to bookbinding for a while, which is when I was living near you, Alex, and we met at the writing group. But yeah, I reached a point where I thought, it's not that I can't do this. It's not that I can't write, and I can't write about the people that I'm interested in. It's just that I never thought that I would be able to, or in a position to do it. And I was quite lucky, actually, because I met Claire O'Callaghan. She was giving a talk about her book on Emily, and I was talking to some friends about it afterwards, and they said, but you've read all of the biographies, why don't you just go and ask if you can write the book about Anne? So I did. Got in touch with Claire. She was very, very supportive. She's my supervisor now, so it's all worked out really nicely. But yeah, writing was always something that I'd been interested in. And I remember I'd come to the writing group and speak to Alex and things, and they were asking me how the book proposal was going, and I was actually writing the proposal and writing a sample chapter while I was on the bus to work in the mornings and things like this. It was just, what you said, Rowan, about getting to 29 and having an existential crisis, an identity crisis. I probably was kind of feeling the same at a similar age, but I'm quite glad I went through that and came out with a book on the other side. So yeah.
That's a great achievement.
It's so difficult to write academically as well. So what would you say stylistically that you would say you learnt when you were writing that, Adelle? Obviously it's very different.
I have a lot of I've had a lot of practice writing academically, because it's kind of what I was doing for a long time. But the biography that I wrote about Anne had to be for more of a general audience, and that's another thing that I'm quite passionate about, I guess. I don't think that knowledge should be limited to the people who necessarily have that vocabulary or that specialist vocabulary, sorry. I think academic writing has its place. So if you're writing a journal for other people who work within your specialism, that's a very good skill to have. But making that knowledge available to other people as well, it's a different skill set. So I tried to kind of write as I might talk to somebody, I guess, when I'm you know, if I'm writing a blog post about some books that I've read, or with the Anne book, I wanted it to be accessible, and I just wanted as many people as possible to be able to read it and want to go and read Anne's books afterwards, and kind of give people some of the tools that they might need to get the most out of her books if they're reading them for the first time. Or say if somebody's been made to read the Brontes at school and they didn't really enjoy the books because they felt like they had to analyze it too much or something. With my book, I wanted people to read my enthusiasm for Anne and her novels and her poetry, and maybe take some of that with them when they went back to her work.
I think you've definitely achieved that as well.
Thank you.
It's a really great book. It's a really absorbing, interesting book, and very, very readable. And I'm 100% behind you on making these stories and these writers as accessible to as many people as we possibly can, because it isn't just about, they weren't highly university educated people of a certain class. They weren't rarefied authors, and these are, at the end of the day, these are just brilliantly good books. They're just great stories, and everybody should be able to enjoy them.
Yeah,
you seem to have a talent writing the Brontes, because you've been commissioned for 2 others, isn't it? So isn't it 4 you commissioned to do now?
Me?
Yeah.
Me, I was thinking, oh, Adele, what are you writing next?
Yeah.
Yes, 2 more on the way. 2 more Bronte mysteries on the way. I'm hoping for 6 in the long term, with maybe a Brussels prequel. But in order to get all that way, I need everybody to get behind these books and make the series work, so that the publishers will let me write all 6 of them. But that is my dream, yes. And it has been optioned for TV, so cross your fingers. Wouldn't that be good?
Well, I think very good, yeah. Adele, you were telling me something about how you managed to combine your physics with the writing of the biography to combine your skills the other day.
Oh, that's so what I was talking about before, how Anne's books have been edited. I have managed to dig myself a very nice little niche. So there's lots of software available, which is quite cool, and I have a lot of experience writing code. So part of my PhD is going to involve putting Anne's novels through some kind of textual analysis software and things like that. So comparing her original text with other editions that have been edited, and just kind of, because I want to look at how her reputation has changed over the years. And I think part of that is because we didn't always have access to her full texts, and especially her poems. So after Anne died, Charlotte went back and edited some of her poems, and one of Anne's most famous poems, her last poem, Charlotte, I think she removed about 8 verses from that poem and changed a lot of the language. So you read Anne's original poem that she wrote when she just found out that she'd been diagnosed with tuberculosis, and Anne's poem, she's quite angry at God even, which, again, the first time I read her version, I was quite surprised, because I'd always thought, oh yeah, Anne's very religious, she's very pious, there's no way she'd kind of be angry with God at any point. But yeah, she is, she's quite angry. She would like to have some more time to do some good in the world, that kind of thing. And you read Charlotte's version and it's very heavily sanitized, and it makes out like Anne is ready to die, basically, and ready to she's fed up of being alive and fed up of living in a world full of sin, that kind of thing. And just to be clear, I don't think Charlotte was a horrible person. She was going through all sorts at the time. She was grieving quite heavily for her siblings. But yeah, so things like I'm doing a lot of analysis of the ways in which Anne's works have been edited, and so how they've been sanitized and what's been taken out and what's been left behind, and the kind of things that reviewers would have been reading at the time when they wrote their reviews that said that her works were clunky. And it's my opinion that they thought that her work was clunky because they were reading a very heavily edited version.
It's so fascinating, the whole treatment of Anne's work via Charlotte, and what Charlotte's motivations were and why it all happened. And I'm just really fascinated in the research that you're doing there, Adelle. I'm very interested to read what you find out, what you discover. I like you, I don't believe for a minute that there was anything kind of malicious intent in what Charlotte was doing. I don't think she was trying to repress her sister's talent, or to hide it, which some people think. But I think she was under an incredible amount of emotional strain and thought she was doing the right thing. I'm sure she was trying to do the right thing, even if she didn't. Bless her.
As book fans, we often read to different genres. I was talking with Rowan earlier that one of my guilty pleasures was romance and rom-coms. So what would you say your guilty pleasure is then, Adelle?
I wouldn't call any of them guilty pleasures, really, because I don't know. I think when I was younger, I was a massive snob, and I'd be like, oh yes, I read the Brontes and I read Daphne du Maurier, and I don't, and I even went through a terrible phase as a teenager of, thinking that women weren't as good at writing books. It's terrible, and I hate that I had that opinion, and then, I can kind of see where it came from, and I'm very glad that I grew out of that. But yeah, guilty pleasures. I don't know, really. I read a lot of graphic novels and comic books and things, but I guess rather than guilty pleasures, I'd call them more of I don't have to switch on my analytical brain as much when I'm reading things for pleasure, I guess.
What do you read for pleasure when you're not writing and writing?
None of my pleasures are guilty. I embrace all of them wholeheartedly. I'm lucky that I get a lot of books to read sent to me, a lot of novels, and I just love reading all sorts of novels. I've read some really great fiction recently. Last to Burn by Will Dean has been one I really enjoyed, and then completely different from that is a book called The Crow Folk by Mark Stay. Love a bit of Laura Purcell. Love contemporary fiction. Love a bit of, oh gosh, I can't even, Marion Keyes. But I think actually the sort of things that I read for when I'm sort of switching off from anything else is usually some kind of history, and usually some kind of obscure history about something really niche, like 17th century beekeeping or something. And when I really want to switch my brain off, I watch a ghost hunting program on TV because that's my favourite.
There's nothing wrong with switching the brain off. I watch a lot of snooker when I'm working on reading and reviewing, because if you review all day, you get a bit tiring. Yeah. We've got a lot of audience questions along the side. I don't know whether you can see them.
I cannot see them on my little device, but if you want to tell me any, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah. I'll get my assistant Pete to read a few of them. I think the questions anyway, the comments on the side anyway.
Both of you visited the Parsonage Museum.
Yeah, we've discussed that one. Yeah.
What's each of your favourite Bronte novels?
We've got one asking which is each of your favourite Bronte novels. For both of you, what's your favourite one?
I find that really hard to answer. I think I have to say Jane Eyre because it was my first novel. But I really genuinely love all of their novels a lot. I love Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, Tennant are my top 3. Tennant of Wildfell Hall are my top 3. But I'm just rereading Agnes Grey at the moment, and it's richer than I remembered it. So what can I tell you? I love them all.
Same really. It's hard to choose between them because all 3 of them have very, very different styles as well. I feel like I should say an Anne book because I do love her very much, but I think my absolute favourite, if I had to choose, is probably Villette. It's just so bizarre as a book. It's got a bit of everything. That has some mystery as well. There's a dead nun in an attic. It's very gothic in that sense, and I feel like Lucy Snow is maybe a much more private, much more tightly wound version of Jane Eyre. She's a mysterious character as well. She's very. I'm a big fan of Villette and the mystery that is Lucy Snow.
What's the lasting legacy the Brontes have left us?
We've got a question about asking what's the lasting legacy the Brontes have left us. I'll ask you both that and see what you both think differently.
The lasting legacy, I think, is there's so much, but I think for me as an individual, the legacy that they gave to me is the courage to try. Is the courage to try and succeed when you're not from a background where you would ordinarily succeed. I think, that's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I think anybody reading them might agree as well, which I guess is not just a personal legacy, but that's anyone who's come into the Brontes will feel that too. And especially with Anne as well, you have very kind of feminist novels and writing about issues that were important to her of the time. So you've got The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which deals with a lot of she doesn't go into detail about the legality of the heroin situation, but you've got a great deal of empathy given to this woman who's left an abusive marriage and taken her son with her, which at the time was against the law because the child, like the wife, I guess, was the husband's property. And that whole book is kind of looking at how the law at the time affected women in marriages that put them in danger, put them and their children in danger. And I think all 3 of them actually make us think about, or at the time they would have made their readers think about things in a way that maybe they hadn't or didn't want to think about them in that way. And they're just very brave books, I think, as well, and give us a lot to relate to.
Yeah, I agree.
It looks like we've covered all the audience questions, and so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Adelle, is there anything that you want to ask Rowan yourself?
Yeah, so I really loved reading The Vanished Bride as a big fan of the Brontes, and one of my favourite things about it was kind of picking up on the parts that link to the Brontes novels themselves, almost like you were writing it as the events of this book or the mysteries that they were solving. These would then go on and inspire their own novels. Like, what were your favourite little kind of Easter eggs to plant, I guess, in the books?
Oh gosh, I have so much fun doing the Easter eggs, and I'll be completely honest, I can't remember what I can't remember which ones I put in now because that was about 3 years ago. But I sort of took the approach of almost reverse engineering the plots of their novels and seeing what possibly could have, you know, added to the inspiration, that an event that I could fictional event, and that might have had some influence on their plots further down the line. I mean, there are some quite obvious ones, I guess, like Chester Grange is owned by Robert Chester. That's pretty obvious. In Diabolical Bones, I have a nurse and orphanage head teacher called Mrs. Paul. And, you know, there are just quite a lot of little... Topwithens Hall is the main setting in Diabolical Bones. And Topwithens is the likely geographical setting for Wuthering Heights. And it's likely that Emily conjured up that location and mixed it in with a couple of other houses, Pondon Hall being one, High Sunderland House being another, and so it's just basically I just did the same thing. I did the same process as Emily: location, imaginary houses, created a new one. There's so many lovely little things that you can do, and things that I like to do is, if I can, is like to slip in a line from letters. If I can put a line in from one of Charlotte's letters into the prose or into the dialogue. Definitely character names, a line from a novel I will put into the dialogue. Sometimes I'll have characters say something that then comes out again of another character's mouth in the novel, you know, pretending in my head that that's coming in the future because it's been influenced by the plot, which in actual fact it's the other way around. So it's easy to get confused by what's real, but but it's just so much fun. I love it, and I love it when people spot them and spot little Easter eggs and spot the links and enjoy it, because it's just, you don't need to know that they're there, but if you do know they're there, it's fun.
I was reading Diabolical Bones over the weekend, and I think you've got a line in there. They've just been up to Topwithens in the snow, and Charlotte's feeling a bit kind of out of breath about the whole thing, and Anne asks her if she's okay, and Anne makes the observation that Charlotte is the smallest and the frailest of the three. And I think I laughed out loud at that part, because Anne is usually the sister who's described as frail and you know, physically quite weak and things, and to have her being worried about Charlotte the other way around, it was quite refreshing in a sense and quite funny.
Yes, yeah, I do enjoy that. And I also think in Diabolical Bones, it's prior to they haven't written their novels yet. They've begun to write their novels, but they haven't finished them, and they certainly haven't sent them to publishers. And Anne's talking about her novel, and Charlotte says, "Well, who wants to read a book about a governess?" So I have quite little bits of fun like that. Yeah.
I must admit, even I spotted the Wuthering Heights references, and I've only seen it in film. So
good.
Yeah. When you're watching and looking at adaptations of the Brontes, what would you say is your favourite? And that comes to both of you, I would say.
Oh. I have quite a big debate about this with some friends of mine. I think my favourite adaptation is the 80s BBC TV series of Jane Eyre with Timothy Dalton in it, because he was just my first TV Mr. Rochester, and I felt quite hard for Timothy Dalton as Mr. Rochester as a small girl of about 12. But I also really like the Ralph Fiennes Catherine. Is it Catherine? Juliette Binoche, Wuthering Heights, because even though it's got so much wrong with it, it's also really quite brilliant as well. So
I think I'll always have a soft spot for the black and white Wuthering Heights with Laurence Olivier, just because I remember watching that when I was quite young, I think. And that was probably, even before visiting the parsonage, that was probably my first introduction to the Brontes. And even though they take some liberties with the plot and Heathcliff is far too handsome, it's still a wonderful record of how it was adapted. But I think I've not seen that many adaptations of any of the Brontes works, really, and I always feel, whenever I watch a Jane Eyre adaptation, I always feel a little bit disappointed that they've taken a lot of the humour out of Jane and Rochester's relationship, especially. They always play it very straight and very serious, whereas whenever I read the book, I feel like it's quite a playful relationship, I guess. But yeah, I'm a big fan of, not an adaptation of their works, but I really enjoyed the Sally Wainwright film To Walk Invisible, which was about the Brontes themselves. And I saw a lot of similarity between the way she characterised the sisters and Bramwell, and the way that you wrote about them, Rowan, in your books, those kinds of the very genuine relationships and things.
Yeah, but I think that's fair comment to say. I think when you're kind of rating those characters, it comes out from the same source material, so it'd be a bit weird if it wasn't kind of similar. Although I think my Emily's the best. I'm just gonna say that. No offense, Sally Wainwright.
No, I am a big fan of your Emily, and I was going to ask, actually. So I really enjoyed all of your characterizations, and especially Emily, and the way that you've written Emily really made me think of Shirley. So Charlotte's novel Shirley, and the way that Charlotte wrote Shirley, and it's supposed to be that Charlotte, when she was coming up with the character for Shirley, she wrote, she wanted to write Emily how she could have been if she had, if she was an heiress and didn't have to marry and, could pretty much do what she wanted. So I was reading the scene where Emily does some breaking and entering in the Vanished Bride, and thinking, wow, this is very Shirley with a pistol kind of. It was really good.
Oh wow, I've never made that comparison before, but I really like it. Thank you. That's lovely. Yes, I think that's the joy of Emily's, in a way, because we don't know her. We know her only really through her poetry and through one novel, and other people's observations of her, that she can almost be anything. She could be anyone to anything to anyone. So for me, she is she's brilliantly good fun.
I was just thinking about their father too, and how you depicted their father in it. I know he's not in it much, but I thought it was really crucial the way you included him too, especially with the cataracts in the Vanished Bride and things. And I was sad.
He may come into it more as we go along, but he's an incredibly important person in their life, and really we have a lot to thank him for, really. So he was a very interesting and seems to me to have been a very compassionate, creative man who really encouraged his children to be creative and independent. So I love him. I've got all the time in the world for Patrick. Love him a lot.
Yeah, Adelle, you were telling us the other day about how he started as a priest and things, when we were talking.
Oh, their dad. Yeah. Again, I think he, from what I've read anyway, he sounds like a wonderful person, and I like him very much. His own life is as interesting as his daughter's lives, I think. So he was born in a small village in Northern Ireland and was very poor, but he was also very intelligent. And I think it was a local vicar, I think, discovered him, and Patrick had set up his own school by the time he was a teenager for some of the other kids and things, and he was sponsored to go to university. I think it was Oxford, where he was ordained and things. So he had an incredible journey of his own, and a lot like Anne, he had a very strong sense of justice and a very huge social conscience, and he was very aware of people who, I think because of his background, he was very aware of people who weren't as well off and people who were being forgotten by society. And he did a lot of work, especially in Haworth, to try and help people who weren't as privileged as he was. And he did a lot to quite literally clean up the village, writing to people about sanitation, because Haworth at the time, they had quite a high death rate because it wasn't the cleanest. For example, the water that they had access to actually kind of ran through the graveyard. So, the people in the village were drinking water that had kind of seeped through lots of graves and stuff like this, and it just wasn't a very healthy place to live at the time, which was why the mortality rate was so high and things like that. But yeah, their dad was very ambitious and very aware that if you had access to an education, and if you had people around you who were willing to help you out and support you in that way, you could change your own life, which I think is something that he passed on to his children. Like, you can, if you have the determination and the ambition, you can most definitely change your own life as well as bettering the lives of the people around you. And I think Anne especially took those kinds of messages to heart.
Yeah.
I think that is a really good thought to end on, and I'd just like to thank both of you for letting us learn a lot more about the Brontes and how to turn them into crime fiction. Thank you very much, both of you, for